Alright, what's going on YouTube? Today we're going to take a look at some of the questions or comments you guys left on the tier list are worthless video. If you have no idea what's going on here, I'm talking about this video right here. You can check it out through the card on the screen right now or the link in the video description. The too long didn't watch goes something like this though. I claim tier lists are not necessary for any player in any ELO bracket. This has been by far my most controversial video to date, and a lot of you guys jumped on the comments and addressed some concerns you had regarding the topic. And before we jump into any questions, I'd like to thank every single one of you that participated in the discussion. These are by far my favorite kind of topics, because there is a lot to talk about and clearly you guys had a thing or two to say about it. Also, I'd like to point out that some of you guys made similar criticisms to the points I made throughout the video, so I bundled some of them for the sake of time and just answered them together. So without further ado, let's take a look at some of the comments you left on that video. I apologize beforehand if I butcher any of your names, I'm sorry. So, Heyo Frieza, or Freeze, says, just to counter argue your points, I don't think they're accurate at all. Tier lists are designed to guide players in each bracket to better ways to climb, but tier lists are generic and don't take into account counter matchups. These tier lists aren't wrong or silly, they're accurately designed for the generic state of the game, also known as the meta. In high elo, we can expect players to know what to do and how to react, mechanically or micro decision making, as a team. In low elo, we should expect no one to be able to. Just because you don't need them doesn't mean they're useless. They're free advice and you can take it or ignore it. Up to you, and just like advice, they aren't always the truth, but generally might be the way forward. And along the same line, Deadeye says, what is your argument against tier lists? They do what they should, tell which champions are stronger than others. But that still doesn't say don't play Caitlyn, she sucks. It says MF is stronger than her at the moment, so the chance of you winning with MF might be higher than with Kate. It is still possible to win with Kate, she just doesn't really fit the current meta at the moment. In my opinion, you didn't really have a strong argument against tier lists. In general, this is somewhat correct. But the overall issue here isn't whether if MF is better than every other ADC or if a champion is overtuned against their specific matchups or whatever. As a matter of fact, I mentioned it briefly on the video. This video isn't about how accurate or inaccurate these lists are. They provide some general sense of the current metagame, and the most played, banned, and banned champions are usually taken into consideration for champion rankings by tier list creators. I'm not saying that tier lists are incorrect. I'm saying that they are worthless because League of Legends is complex enough to the point in which picking 3 champions and calling them OP for this patch doesn't cut it. To illustrate my point, suppose we could reinvent the game from scratch. Only that in our version of the game, we strip down the champ roster to 3 champs and only 1 lane. We'll call our champs Rock, Paper, and Scissors, like in the Rock, Paper, Scissors game. But in this version, Rock beats Scissors 66% of the time, Scissors beats Paper 66% of the time, and Paper beats Rock 66% of the time. If tier list creators try to come up with a tier list at this very moment, it would be absolutely nonsensical, since every matchup is perfectly balanced to win 66% of the time against one champion and lose the same 66 to the other one. But of course, with time our game gets stale because everyone complains every match is a coin flip on whether or not you get the right matchup. So we gotta make changes to the game to improve that, and let's also assume adding more content like new champion or items is just not an option at the moment. So we tweak our champions to shake up the metagame and end up after playtesting with something like this. All of a sudden a tier list makes a ton of sense, primarily because Rock is so dominant compared to the rest of the champion roster people have available to them. And as game designers, we realized this fault and how it's impossible to keep the game fresh and interesting without adding new content to it. So what we do is not necessarily nerf Rock right away. Instead, we introduce new elements to the game which give counterplay to Rock's dominance. We'll do it by adding a new champion, Hammer, which is extremely good against Rock but is worse against the rest. And at this point we've reached kind of a somewhat decent metagame here. Rock's really good against every champion except Hammer, so if players have trouble against Rock, they can pick Hammer. And if Hammer is too prevalent because of this, they can simply turn to Paper or Scissors to counter Hammer. But then, what do tier list creators do? What can they place as the best character in the game? Well, clearly Rock still, right? Because he beats 2 out of its 3 possible matchups. Surely every tier list places Rock as the strongest pick for the current state of the game. But Hammer still destroys Rock. You see, this kind of information simply cannot be transmitted through a tier list. Systems which have no absolute dominant strategy cannot be organized in a tier list. This is all the more evident in a game like the real-life League of Legends, where there are so many variables to think of when picking a champion other than just its raw average power. It's so much more important to understand why a certain champion or strategy is good and try to counter it appropriately. Going back to our example for a second, smart players will realize that Rock is dominant and will therefore play Hammer. These players will certainly rise above Rock abusers and set the metagame with Hammer as the predominant pick. When the next tier list rolls out with Hammer as the strongest pick and Hammer is predominant, the same players will jump to Paper and Scissors while everyone is playing Hammer. And so on for every step of the cycle. You see, these players set the metagame. Everyone else is just conforming to what has already been perceived as the strongest pick and therefore are always quote-unquote a step behind of the competition. Now, of course, I'm not saying there will always be a proper counter to any particular strategy, but even if you fail at finding one, you'll learn so much about the game in the process, and in a much more complex game like League of Legends, that ultimately makes you a better player than blindly playing what's perceived as strong during any patch. Parker I says, I strongly disagree. I'm currently ranked Platinum 2 and champion strength in the meta is crucial for determining who wins and loses games. Oftentimes, games are lost in champions alike because someone picked a lower tier champion. Alright, let's not get confused here. There are obviously different power levels amongst all champions in the game. Some are necessarily going to be more generally powerful than others. It's impossible to completely and perfectly balance a game like League is nowadays. Let me emphasize the word generally. Going back to our example from the previous question, Rock is generally the most powerful champion, but Hammer beats it quite easily. In League, this happens extremely often. Some champions perform their best under specific conditions. We could call these champions niche picks. For instance, suppose you're playing ADC in your last pick. Your comp up to this point is Fiora, Yasuo, Jarvan, and any support. The support really doesn't matter. The point is, 3 out of 5 champions, including big damage dealers, are all physical damage. What on earth do? Do you pick whatever ADC happens to be thought as the strongest according to some tier list? Or do you ponder and think what fits your composition best? Which, by the way, in this particular case, off the top of my head, is Varus, Kog'Maw, or Corki. They all seem like the best picks. It is up to you to decide whether you pick the correct champion for the task at hand after the game is over and you evaluate how it went. In short, for this question, basically, power levels do exist. There are general power levels, but they're not necessarily reflected on tier lists. And by no means a generally strong champion is gonna be generally strong on every situation as opposed to a niche champion that perfectly fits the role that you need. Duplex Gaming and Keith Walker said, Riot is not actually very good at balancing champions. Okay, I'll grant that this was somewhat of a weak argument, however I'd still like to explain where it came from. If you go onto OPGG and look up champions by role, you'd notice that almost none of them surpassed the 55% win rate overall. This was not always the case, and whenever a champion spikes way out of hand into ridiculous win rates, they get hotfixed almost immediately, which back in the day was just not the case, which is why I use the example of the Phantom Dancer stacking and Jax and whatever. Now, win rates are a topic which I'm not too keen on to looking at generally as well, but it is the only metric we have as players to properly measure how well a champion is performing. So we kind of have to make do with what we have. I do, however, consider that there are champions which have some extremely obnoxious and unfun mechanics, namely champions like Zoe. God, I just hate Zoe so much. She's like, she's not good enough for a ban, but every time, dude, that little rocket, that battle star, oh my god, fuck, I just... Champions like Zoe have mechanics that are very hit or miss. And just feel bad for either party playing in the same match as them, which might lead to the presumption that they are overpowered, and who knows, maybe they are. But if Riot can't see that in the numbers, then there's not much they can do about it. I'd actually like to elaborate on Zoe particularly later on, so I'll just drop the topic for now because it really deserves its own video. Nicholas Alcover Chelby said, "But if you learn an S tier champ to a decent level, it's better than to be a one-trick pony. Not because you're better or worse on the champ, but because it fits better into the meta?" Question mark, question mark, question mark, question mark. Dedication and effort one-trick ponies put into their champions is so monumental that they are almost immune to metagame changes. Take that, obviously, with a grain of salt. And I'd only say that about the good ones at least. But beyond that point of showcasing one-trick ponies, it was not to imply that one-trick ponies have an inherent advantage over everyone else because they play one champion, but rather to show that success can be had by playing something other than the flavor of the month top tier champion for your role. And finally, Herb says, "Completely irrelevant video and makes no sense whatsoever. I don't understand how you can possibly argue about a tier list that helps all players from bronze to challenger to show what champions they should be playing." I'd like to answer, if I may, your comment with a similar comment. Completely irrelevant comment. It makes no sense whatsoever. I don't understand how you can possibly write so many words and not say anything at the same time. And that's about everything I read that really needed addressing. But I'd like to finish with a closing thought, if I may. Tier lists will thrive content-wise, not because creators want to see lower elo players fail, or spread misinformation, or something like that, but rather because, as a content producer, regardless of whether if it's video or written, they're extremely easy to produce. You can pump one out every patch, and there is just some inherent interest in lists we humans have which I simply can't explain. This is why YouTube channels like WatchMojo are so successful. Something about the journey to the first place in a list is extremely appealing to people, including myself. So the next time you're merely going through a tier list, keep in mind that they are extremely general and are not, by a long shot, the most accurate way to interpret the metagame. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.